Back to follow-up segment tonight. As you may know, President Obama began a controversy yesterday by comparing Christian atrocities nearly 1,000 years ago to Muslim atrocities today.
The Department of Defense. The Department of Defense has just issued a new list of extremists that should be watched. And on that, in fact, number one, past the Muslim Brotherhood, past Hamas, Hezbollah, number one, evangelical Christians.
President Obama making a shocking comparison at the National Prayer Breakfast, equating Muslim extremism to Christianity.
And lest we get on our high horse and think this is unique to some other place, remember that during the Crusades and the Inquisition, people committed terrible deeds in the name of Christ. In our home country, slavery and Jim Crow all too often was justified in the name of Christ.
Well, our next guest is appalled by this analogy. Bishop E.W. Jackson from the Called Church and the founder of STAND joins us now. Bishop, thanks for joining Fox and Friends here.
Thanks for having me, Elizabeth.
What place did Christianity and Christ have in that equation yesterday at the National Prayer Breakfast?
You know, Elizabeth, I have a message for the president with all due respect to him and to the office. Mr. President, if you don't want to give terrorists a recruitment tool, instead of closing Guantanamo Bay, frankly, sir, you ought to close your mouth, because you just gave them a gigantic propaganda tool. They called us crusaders, and you've just confirmed it. Mr. President, we're not on our high horse. What we are is on high alert. And the American people would like for once to know that you're willing to defend Christianity and defend America instead of defending Islam.
Bishop, you served in the Marine Corps for 3 years. You're a veteran. When you talk about propaganda, the only thing propaganda does right now is help recruit for ISIS and strengthen the enemy. For our veterans right now and our military personnel, how much more danger did those words actually put our service members in?
Oh, I think he's given them a gigantic recruitment tool. He's told them, once again, he's apologized for America. He's conjured up the image of crusaders. And he's basically justified exactly what Osama bin Laden was saying, that we are encroaching on them. I would remind the president that the Crusades began in 1096 as a response to Islamic aggression and the fact that they had conquered the Holy Land and they were oppressing Eastern Christians. And there was a response to that. So if the president is even going to cite that as an example, then he ought to get his history complete.
Well, Bishop, you just did something the president won't do. You used the word Islamic. Let me ask you this. Not only did the president not protect Christians and, in fact, really go after them, attacking them by invoking the name of Christ yesterday, some would say, but he continued on the path of not calling the enemy what it is, not saying radical Islam. Don't you believe that in not saying that, he's actually protecting radical Islam by not calling it out?
You know, I don't know how to explain this, but this president does everything he possibly can to defend Islam and does almost nothing to defend the honor of this country. And yes, once again, he's giving them exactly what they want. And, you know, Elizabeth, they're laughing at us because all they see it as is a sign of weakness, and America needs to operate from strength.
I want to ask you now for a strong message to Christians who feel as though they came under attack yesterday by the President of the United States. What is your word to those of faith today?
Pray for our president. I think he's deeply misguided and confused. Pray for our country. We need leaders who will defend the integrity of our nation and to continue to stand up for what you know is right.
He spoke after meeting with Muslim leaders, and that was an off-the-record thing that we all knew was going to happen earlier this week, and now it's happened. And it was the first roundtable with a Muslim-only group that, but that aside, I do think the timing is interesting. We don't know all the notes and details that came out of that meeting because only so much has been made public, but I'd be curious to know if some of the language that he's using now wasn't informed maybe by what happened.
So understand that the values of Christianity led to the end of slavery and the end of Jim Crow.
Bingo.
If anybody has read anything in the last
But he also got the
years.
facts wrong. I mean, Ambassador Bolton, when he mentioned the Spanish Inquisition, where people died not by the church killing them on a witch hunt, it was by Spanish authorities. And you think about those 100 people that died, that's a normal lunch break for Boko Haram.
Yeah, look, by referring to the Crusades, he validated one of al-Qaeda and ISIS's main points. It was Osama bin Laden that called Americans in the West crusaders. And he's saying, yeah, basically we're crusaders.
But you have to put those misdeeds into context. For example, the president talked about the Crusades. The Crusades were terrible, but they were also the reaction to hundreds of years of Muslim aggression and oppression that preceded them. And yet, in the 450 years of the Inquisition, you had about 2,200 people who were killed. That's about 5 a year. More people were killed in a single day by Muslim terrorists on 9/11 than in the entire Inquisition put together. And that is why this equivalence doesn't hold up.
Also, Doctor, the Crusades were 1,000 years ago. You know, ISIS is burning up people today and crucifying kids over in the Middle East today.
Yes, that's exactly right. And look, we need to say something that is politically incorrect, but is absolutely true.
Go ahead.
And that is, okay, that is when these Christian nut jobs do things that are wrong and violent, they are acting in opposition to their faith. You cannot find a single verse in the New Testament that commands violence against unbelievers. But when these radical Islamists commit acts of terror, they can point to numerous verses in the Quran that say to commit violence against the infidels. You know, Jesus said, love your enemies. Muhammad said, crucify your enemies, amputate their limbs. Jesus was the Prince of Peace. Muhammad was the Prince of War. The fact is, those are the facts, and facts are stubborn things.
Should Christians be offended by what the president said yesterday?
I think they should be offended by the president. You know, this is a rare talent to be able to stand up at a prayer breakfast and both deny the root of Islamic terrorism and at the same time degrade Christians. I mean, it's unbelievable that he would do that. But again, Christianity is going to survive President Obama. And my problem with this, Steve, is this is a part of a disturbing pattern of the president. Last week, he said he refused to acknowledge that this was a religious war.
Joining us now from Dallas, Pastor Robert Jeffress, a Fox News contributor. So I want you to put Jesus at the prayer breakfast, and there's the Nazarene, and he's multiplying the loaves and fishes so everybody has plenty to eat. All right? And he hears this from the President of the United States. How do you think Jesus would react?
I would imagine that Jesus would be outraged that the president would willfully mischaracterize a movement like Christianity that bears Christ's name. I believe that Jesus, who said it would be better to be cast into the sea than to harm a child, would be incensed that Obama would dare link Christianity to ISIS, an organization that tortures children, buries them alive, and crucifies them. The president mentioned the Inquisition. The Inquisition lasted 450 years. There were 2,200 people who died. That's about 5 a year. More people died on 9/11 one day at the hand of Muslim terrorists than in all of the Inquisition. And you know, I hear people talk about Christians who commit these abortion clinic bombings. Do you know how many people have died in abortion clinic bombings? A total of 8. Why, that's not even a good day's work for a Muslim terrorist. There have been millions of people slaughtered by Muslim extremists. What I'm saying is there is no moral equivalency here.
Okay. Do you believe that Barack Obama at the prayer breakfast yesterday meant to slight Christianity?
Absolutely. And let me tell you what his real goal is. His real goal in stepping up there was to deny the relationship between terrorism and Islam, and the way he was going to do it would be by demeaning and degrading the Christian faith. It's kind of like a verbal sleight of hand trick, Bill. Instead of focusing on ISIS burning people alive and burying kids, let's focus instead on these Christians and the terrible things that they've done. He knew exactly what he was doing, and he should be ashamed of himself.
Didn't he know that people like you, to some extent me, were going to come after him, and that it was going to be very hard for him to defend his position? Did he know that?
He knew that, and he doesn't care. Look, people have asked me, am I offended by what the president said? Yes, I'm offended as a Christian, but as an American, I'm alarmed that we have a president who will not acknowledge the root cause of the threat that we are facing. You've been comparing night after night this movement to Nazism. Look, the Nazis were trying to establish the master race. Islamists are trying to establish the master faith. We better wake up and realize what's going on here.
All right, Pastor, thanks, as always.
I think a lot of people are upset, too, because there was something that was happening at the same time. Not only was he had audacity to get out and name Christians somehow and having anything to do with what happened last week and the week before, but also not naming radical Islam for what it is. So not having the courage to call out the true enemy that lit the match, that burned a man alive, yet calling out Christianity. And you say?
He never once in his speech said we are fighting against Islamic jihad. He never even said that these people are a perversion of Islam, even though everyone who is in the fight says it is, everyone except Barack Obama. He also brought in Jim Crow laws as if it was Christians who were responsible for racism in America. I think he's forgetting that it was the Christian movement led by the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who resisted racism, and many of the most staunch voices that helped to bring this country in a whole new understanding of racial justice were voices from the pulpits. And in fact, it was the pulpits of America. Yeah, some of them were wrong, but many of them were the ones who brought the conscience of the nation to get this right. Same thing with slavery. This president has a high horse himself. It's his teleprompter. And what was shocking about this speech, this wasn't an ad-lib, off-the-cuff remark. This was scripted. He knew what he wanted to say, and how anybody, whether they're with the New York Times or anyone, can hear that speech and say, yep, that pretty well accurately reflected what's happening in the world. Elizabeth, I just can't even begin to fathom how they could defend it.
Sure. Two things. Some would say, Governor, that in not naming radical Islam for what it is, it actually protects the real enemy. And secondly, you know, the circle of influence around the president have a lot of people concerned here. You know, he met with the group of initially unnamed Muslim leaders in the community here. Do you think that influenced his speech and why he was so protective of some, but yet not of others?
I don't think that meeting influenced him. I think he's already influenced. I mean, everything he does is against what Christians stand for, and he's against the Jews in Israel. The one group of people that can know they have his undying, unfailing support would be the Muslim community.
Soldiers are told Christians are radical terrorists.
An explosive claim from a soldier who attended a pre-deployment briefing at Fort Hood says that soldiers were told that Christians, Tea Partiers, and anti-abortion activists were a radical threat tearing this country apart. He says that soldiers were told that anyone found to be supporting these groups would be subject to discipline under the Uniform Code of Military Justice. The soldier said that he was shocked and he felt like my religious liberties that I risk my life and sacrifice time away from my family to fight for were being taken away. Well, that ties into the video that aired last night. Soldiers warn of the coming gun confiscation. And today on the Alex Jones Show, another veteran called in and said that he too had been given a litmus test.
Let's go to Jason in Missouri, who's Army and police. Thank you for calling in and holding. Sir, you're on the air.
The questions were as follows. The ones that I remember. Would you fire upon American citizens armed? Would you fire upon American citizens unarmed? Would you quarantine American cities in times of national emergency?
So as you can tell, this plan for total tyranny has been in effect for quite some time.
Also, Homeland Security says people who oppose abortion or worry about the threat of illegal aliens could pose a radical threat to America. They're the ones we need to be watching at Homeland Security. Why are conservative values suddenly being singled out as a terror threat? You got a bloody right to say,
right, you're bloody well right, you know you got a right to say.
From the Department of Homeland Security sent to law enforcement agencies across the country warning about the potential for an increase in right-wing extremist activity. It warns about groups and individuals dedicated to single issues like abortion, immigration, and gun rights, and even raises a red flag about veterans returning home from the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan.